Hey guys, tonight we're not scaling Mount Olympus or battling mythical beasts. Not exactly. Instead, we're settling into the quiet corners of ancient Greece, ready to delve into a tale of immense strength, profound tragedy, and a whole lot of very, very tiring work. Imagine, if you will, the gentle hum of cicadas on a warm Mediterranean night, the scent of wild thyme on the breeze, and the distant, almost imperceptible rumble of a hero sighing perhaps from sheer exhaustion. We're going to explore the life of perhaps the most famous and certainly the most overworked demigod of all time. We're venturing into Hercules' troubled birth and early life, where even before he lifted a single club, his destiny was already tangled by divine jealousy and the seeds of future sorrow. You probably won't survive this journey awake, but that's entirely the point, isn't it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in ancient Greece, a world where the gods aren't just distant figures. They're very much involved in human affairs, often for their own petty squabbles and passions. And in this divine soap opera, no one causes more drama than Zeus, the king of the gods. Hercules, you see, wasn't born from a regular mortal union. Oh no, his father was none other than Zeus himself, who, true to form, disguised himself as Amphitryon, a mortal general, to trick Alcmene, a virtuous and beautiful queen of Tiryns, into sleeping with him. This divine deception, a common trope for Zeus, immediately sets Hercules apart, granting him immense, almost unparalleled strength from birth. But, as with all of Zeus's mortal dalliances, this act immediately incurred the furious wrath of his perpetually jealous wife, Hera. Hera, the queen of the gods, was not one to forgive or forget. From the moment Hercules was conceived, she vowed to make his life a misery. This divine vendetta would become the defining struggle of Hercules' existence, a constant unseen force, pushing him towards hardship and tragedy long before he ever faced a lion or a hydra. Even before his birth, Hera attempted to thwart him. She tried to delay his birth to ensure that his cousin Eurystheus would be born first, and thus inherit the kingship of Mycenae, fulfilling a prophecy that the next-born descendant of Perseus, which both were, would rule. Though Zeus outsmarted her temporarily, Hera's machinations ensured that Hercules would always be subordinate to Eurystheus, setting the stage for the infamous labors. His very name reflects this divine struggle. He was originally named Alcides, meaning mighty one or strong one. But later he would become known as Heracles or Hercules, in Roman mythology meaning glory of Hera or Hera's fame. It's a cruel, ironic name given that Hera despised him, yet his legendary deeds would ultimately bring her grudgingly a form of glory. Even as an infant, Hercules displayed his extraordinary, divinely inherited strength. One night, while he and his mortal twin brother Iphicles lay in their crib, Hera sent 2 enormous snakes to kill the infant Hercules. Imagine a tiny baby barely able to crawl, instinctively responding not with fear, but with immense power. Hercules, the future hero, calmly strangled one serpent in each hand, while his brother screamed in terror. This incident, witnessed by his astounded parents, confirmed his divine lineage and foreshadowed his legendary might. It was his first labor long before the official 12 began. One quirky tidbit: despite being half divine, Hercules often struggled with human flaws: a fiery temper, a love for wine, and a certain impulsiveness. This blend of godlike strength and relatable human imperfection makes him one of the most compelling and, perhaps surprisingly, one of the most boring heroes to observe when he's just trying to live a normal life. Historians still argue whether Hera's relentless persecution of Hercules was simply a narrative device to explain his trials, or if it reflected deeper cultural anxieties about divine intervention and the preordained nature of fate. Either way, his early life was anything but peaceful, destined for greatness, but also for immense suffering. So, as you prepare to drift off, consider the infant Hercules, already battling divine wrath in his crib. His entire life was to be a cosmic struggle set in motion before he could even walk, a constant battle against the odds, ultimately leading to the arduous deeds that would etch his name into eternity. You've just seen the extraordinary and deeply unfair circumstances of Hercules' birth, marked by Zeus's infidelity and Hera's immediate burning jealousy. But Hera's wrath was far from satisfied with sending snakes to his crib. Her divine hatred would later escalate to a horrifying, soul-shattering act, leading to the pivotal moment that sets Hercules on his famous path of atonement. This brings us to Hera's madness and tragic deed, the agonizing event that utterly devastates Hercules' life, transforming him from a promising young hero into a man burdened by an unbearable sorrow. Imagine Hercules in his youth, having grown into a magnificent warrior, strong and virtuous. He had married the beautiful Princess Megara, daughter of King Creon of Thebes, and had several beloved children. He was living a life that for a time seemed stable, even happy. He had defended Thebes heroically, earning the respect of his peers and the love of his family. He was establishing a normal domestic life, as normal as it could be for a demigod of prodigious strength. But Hera, the goddess who never forgot a slight, watched this happiness with seething resentment. She could not directly harm Zeus, so she continuously sought to punish his mortal offspring. Her method of revenge against Hercules was cruel and insidious. She sent a fit of divine madness upon him, a blinding, uncontrollable rage that clouded his mind and distorted his perception of reality. Under the influence of this horrifying delirium, Hercules tragically mistook his own wife and children for monstrous enemies, or the hateful creatures sent by Hera. Imagine the terror, the confusion, the sheer unimaginable horror of a man driven by an external divine force committing the most unthinkable act against those he loved most. In his maddened state, with his superhuman strength, he mercilessly slew his entire family, his beloved wife Megara and their children. When the divine madness finally lifted and Hercules returned to his senses, he was confronted with the horrific reality of what he had done. The scene of carnage, the faces of his slain family, the realization that he, Hercules the hero, had committed such an atrocity, plunged him into an abyss of despair, guilt, and profound grief. It was an unbearable burden, a psychological torment far worse than any physical labor he would ever face. He had lost everything, not through his own villainy, but through the cruel manipulation of a vengeful goddess. Overcome with remorse and utterly distraught, Hercules considered taking his own life. He was a hero without purpose, a man whose strength had been turned against his innocent loved ones. His reputation was shattered, his soul tormented. He sought solitude, withdrawing from society, unable to bear the weight of his actions or the gaze of others. One quirky tidbit about this tragedy: some versions of the myth suggest that the madness was so complete that Hercules didn't even recognize his own home, believing it to be a fortress of enemies. This adds to the utter psychological devastation of the act, as he was completely detached from reality. Historians still argue whether this myth serves as a cautionary tale about unchecked power, a dramatic explanation for a historical figure's decline, or a theological justification for the hero's subsequent acts of penance, suggesting that even divinely inflicted suffering must be atoned for. This profound personal tragedy is the dark crucible that forges the hero you know. It is the catalyst that drives Hercules to seek purification and atonement, leading him to consult the Oracle of Delphi, desperate for a path to cleanse his soul and redeem his monstrous deeds. The stage is now truly set for the labors, not as feats of glory, but as a desperate act of penance for a deed too terrible to bear a lifelong sentence from a vindictive goddess. You've just witnessed the horrific culmination of Hera's wrath, leaving Hercules utterly broken and consumed by guilt. With his life shattered and his soul tormented by the memory of his tragic deed, he could not simply live with such an unbearable burden. He desperately needed a path to redemption, a way to atone for the unspeakable acts committed under divine madness. This led him to the most sacred and authoritative voice in the Greek world, bringing us to the Oracle of Delphi's decree, the fateful prophecy that would dictate Hercules' entire future and set him on the arduous path of his legendary labors. Imagine Hercules, renowned for his strength, but now humbled by his grief, making the long journey to Delphi. This wasn't just any trip. It was a pilgrimage to the Omphalos, the navel of the world, believed to be the center of the earth. The oracle of Delphi, presided over by the Pythia, a priestess of Apollo, was the most respected source of divine prophecy in ancient Greece. Her pronouncements were considered the direct words of the gods, immutable and inescapable. Hercules approached the sacred sanctuary, perhaps after undergoing purification rituals, his heart heavy with despair. He sought guidance, a penance, anything that could cleanse his soul and free him from the overwhelming guilt. He asked the Pythia how he could atone for his terrible crime. The Pythia's response was a momentous decree that would define the rest of his life. She commanded him to go to Tiryns, the very city of his youth, and serve its king Eurystheus for a period of 12 years. During this service, he was to perform a series of labors that Eurystheus would assign to him. The Pythia declared that if Hercules successfully completed these tasks, he would be purified of his sin, and more astonishingly, would be granted immortality among the gods. This prophecy was a bitter pill for Hercules. Eurystheus was his cousin, a man known for his cowardice and weakness, who was arguably far less noble than Hercules himself. The idea of a mighty demigod, the son of Zeus, serving a lesser mortal was deeply humiliating. Furthermore, the number of labors was not initially specified as 12. That number would unfold over time as Eurystheus continued to concoct increasingly impossible tasks. The decree was a cunning continuation of Hera's vengeance. It was Hera who had orchestrated Eurystheus's birth before Hercules's to ensure his kingship, and it was Hera who undoubtedly influenced the Pythia's pronouncement, knowing that Eurystheus, being weak and fearful, would be easily manipulated into devising labors designed to kill Hercules. The seemingly divine command for atonement was in essence a prolonged, divinely sanctioned assassination attempt. One quirky tidbit about the oracle: the Pythia's prophecies were often delivered in ambiguous or cryptic verses requiring interpretation. But in Hercules' case, the command was surprisingly clear: serve Eurystheus, perform his labors, and achieve immortality. This directness underscored the divine weight of his impending trials. Historians still argue whether the oracle of Delphi genuinely served as a political and social arbiter offering psychological guidance, or if its pronouncements were often shaped by existing power dynamics, such as Hera's influence over Eurystheus. Either way, for Hercules it was a direct path, however agonizing to purification. So, Hercules, despite his humiliation and dread, had his path laid out for him. The oracle of Delphi's decree bound him to a servitude that would test his strength, his endurance, and his very sanity. The agonizing guilt drove him forward, and the promise of immortality, a liberation from mortal suffering, offered a distant glimmering hope. The long, boring, and endlessly perilous journey of the 12 labors was about to begin, not for glory, but for redemption. You've just witnessed the fateful decree from the oracle of Delphi, condemning Hercules to a humiliating servitude under his much weaker cousin. This sets the stage for the dynamic that would define his legendary trials. We now turn our attention to Eurystheus, the feeble taskmaster, the king of Tyrants and Mycenae, a petty, cowardly, and easily manipulated figure whose weakness, ironically, became the driving force behind Hercules' greatest heroic deeds. Imagine a powerful demigod forced to take orders from a simpering monarch who hides in a bronze jar. You see, Eurystheus was everything. Hercules was not weak, fearful, and lacking in true courage. He gained his kingship through Hera's machinations, ensuring he was born before Hercules, thus fulfilling a prophecy that the firstborn descendant of Perseus would rule Mycenae. This divine favor, however, did not grant him strength or wisdom, only power. Hera, always eager to torment Hercules, found the perfect instrument in Eurystheus. She knew of his cowardice and easily preyed upon his fear of Hercules' immense strength and popularity. Eurystheus, terrified that Hercules might one day usurp his throne or simply overwhelm him, was more than willing to devise tasks that would surely lead to the demigod's demise. His insecurity was his guiding principle. Each time Hercules returned from a completed labor, Eurystheus would be filled with fresh panic and renewed determination to concoct an even more impossible and deadly task. He wasn't looking for honorable service. He was looking for an excuse to eliminate his cousin. His requests were designed not for any public good, but solely as a means to get rid of Hercules, either through death by monstrous claw or tooth, or by driving him to despair and failure. Perhaps the most famous detail illustrating Eurystheus' overwhelming cowardice is his reaction to Hercules bringing back the Nemean Lion. When Hercules returned, carrying the massive, terrifying carcass of the beast draped over his shoulders, Eurystheus was so utterly terrified that he reportedly hid himself in a large bronze jar, or pythos. From that point onward, he often refused to meet Hercules face to face, instead communicating his commands through a herald, or even shouting them from the safety of his hiding place. Imagine being the mighty Hercules, having just wrestled a monstrous lion, only to report to a king too afraid to even look at you. This cowardly figure hiding in his jar becomes an almost comical yet crucial counterpoint to Hercules' heroism. His feebleness forces Hercules to perform increasingly grander and more outlandish feats. Without Eurystheus' constant fear and malice, Hercules might never have faced such an extraordinary sequence of challenges. His very weakness inadvertently pushed Hercules towards unparalleled greatness. One quirky tidbit about Eurystheus, his hiding in the bronze jar, has become a lasting image in art and literature, a visual shorthand for cowardly authority figure. It's a reminder that not all figures of power in Greek myths were noble or brave. Historians still argue whether Eurystheus was a purely fictional character created to provide a narrative framework for Hercules' labors, or if he was based on a historical king whose perceived cowardice was exaggerated for mythic purposes. Either way, his role as the petty taskmaster is indispensable to the heroic cycle. So, as you drift toward sleep, consider the absurdity of this powerful demigod, Hercules, serving a trembling, insignificant king, Eurystheus, cowering in his bronze jar, unwittingly pushed Hercules towards immortality, proving that even the most boring, cowardly figures can, through their very flaws, become catalysts for legend. The stage is now perfectly set for the first of the arduous, yet ultimately boringly repetitive labors to begin. You've just been introduced to the peculiar dynamic between the mighty Hercules and his cowardly taskmaster, Eurystheus, hiding in his bronze jar. Now, with the divine decree set and the fear-driven commands issuing from Terrans, Hercules embarks on the very first, and in some ways, most iconic of his legendary trials. This brings us to the Nemean Lion skinning a monster, a labor that immediately establishes Hercules' unparalleled strength and cleverness, demonstrating that not all monsters can be defeated by conventional means. Imagine the sheer terror of facing a beast whose hide is impenetrable and whose roar echoes across the valleys. You see, for his very first labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to bring him the hide of the Nemean lion. This wasn't just any lion. This was a monstrous, terrifying beast that terrorized the region of Nemea, savaging livestock and humans alike. It was larger than any ordinary lion, with formidable claws, and most crucially, a hide that was impervious to all mortal weapons. Arrows bounced off it, spears shattered against its flesh, and even swords could not pierce its thick, almost magical skin. This made the beast virtually invincible to typical heroic attacks. Hercules journeyed to Nemea, seeking out the lair of this formidable creature. He quickly discovered the futility of conventional combat. He shot arrows at it, which merely bounced off its hide. He struck it with his sword, and the blade bent. Realizing that brute force alone, at least with weapons, would not suffice, Hercules knew he had to adapt his strategy. This is where Hercules' resourcefulness beyond mere strength came into play. He cornered the lion in its lair, a cave with two entrances. Hercules cleverly blocked one entrance, forcing the lion to confront him in a confined space. Then, abandoning all conventional weaponry, Hercules used his own Herculean strength. He grappled with the beast barehanded. Imagine the raw, visceral struggle, man versus monster, muscle against muscle, claw against flesh, in a brutal, silent wrestling match within the dark confines of the cave. Eventually, Hercules managed to overpower the Nemean lion. He held it in a vice-like grip, squeezing the life out of it, either by strangling it or by crushing its skull with his bare hands. The sheer terrifying power required for this feat immediately distinguished Hercules from any other hero. He didn't just kill it. He literally choked the life out of an unkillable beast. But the labor wasn't over. Eurystheus demanded the hide. And here lay another problem. How do you skin a creature whose hide is impenetrable to mortal tools? Hercules, after much contemplation, discovered the solution. He used the lion's own incredibly sharp claws to flay its hide. The very tools that made the lion invincible were also the key to taking its trophy. He then donned the lion's hide, wrapping its massive, impervious skin around his own body. This not only provided him with an invulnerable armor, making him even more formidable for future labors, but also served as a visible, terrifying symbol of his triumph. When he returned to Mycenae, carrying the lion's enormous carcass and wearing its hide, Eurystheus, as you recall, was so petrified that he hid in his bronze jar, realizing the terrifying power of the demigod he now commanded. One quirky tidbit: the lion's hide, once worn by Hercules, became his signature attribute, making him instantly recognizable in art and literature. It also explains why he's almost always depicted wearing or carrying a lion skin. Historians still argue whether the Nemean Lion myth symbolizes the triumph of human ingenuity over brute force, or simply the sheer, unparalleled power of Hercules that transcended even divine invulnerability. Either way, it set a formidable precedent for the labors to come. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture Hercules grappling barehanded with an invincible beast, eventually wearing its hide as his triumphant cloak. The Nemean Lion was merely the opening act, a fearsome introduction to the boredom of repetitive monster slaying that would define Hercules' long, arduous path to atonement and immortality. You can almost feel the rough, heavy hide smelling faintly of ancient lion and incredible strength. You've just witnessed Hercules' brutal, bare-handed triumph over the Nemean Lion, earning him an impenetrable hide and cementing Eurystheus' abject terror. But if the first labor tested his strength and ingenuity, the second would challenge his very understanding of combat, introducing a foe that grew stronger with every blow. This brings us to the Lernaean Hydra head-chopping challenge, a monstrous multi-headed serpent that famously regenerated, requiring Hercules to think beyond brute force and accept crucial assistance. Imagine a creature whose every wound birthed new venomous heads, a truly tiresome enemy. You see, for his second labor, Eurystheus, likely still cowering, commanded Hercules to destroy the Lernaean Hydra. This wasn't just a big snake. It was a truly formidable monster dwelling in the swamps of Lerna, a chthonic underworld-related beast with numerous heads, typically depicted with 9, though some versions claim more. And here was its terrifying secret: for every head that was cut off, 2 new heads would grow back in its place. To make matters worse, its central head was immortal, and its breath blood, and even its tracks were poisonous. This was not a fight to be won by simply swinging a club. Hercules journeyed to the swampy lair, accompanied by his faithful nephew, Iolaus. This detail is crucial, for this labor would prove to be one that Hercules could not complete alone, a rare instance where he needed direct assistance. The Hydra was also guarded by a giant crab sent by Hera, which attacked Hercules' feet during the battle, further complicating matters. Hercules initially tried his usual method. He brought down his mighty club, smashing the Hydra's heads. But to his dismay, and probably a groan of exhaustion, as soon as one head was crushed, two new ones sprouted from the wound. Imagine the sheer futility, the endless, maddening repetition of cutting heads only to see more appear. It was a truly boring cycle of combat, yielding no progress. Realizing that conventional attacks were useless, Hercules quickly adapted. He called upon Iolaus for help. His clever nephew devised a brilliant, if gruesome, strategy. As soon as Hercules lopped off a Hydra head with his sword, Iolaus would immediately cauterize the neck stump with a burning brand. This searing heat prevented the new heads from growing back. Together, they worked in a horrific rhythm. Hercules would slice, and Iolaus would sear. Head after head was severed and cauterized, until finally only the central immortal head remained. This head, being impervious to even their combined efforts, Hercules eventually severed, and then to ensure it could never do harm again, he buried it deep under a massive rock. He also dipped his arrows in the Hydra's potent, venomous blood, making them deadly for future battles, a powerful, if dangerous, enhancement to his arsenal. When Hercules returned to Eurystheus, the cowardly king, ever eager to find fault, declared that this labor did not count. Why? Because Hercules had received assistance from Iolaus. This petty disqualification meant Hercules would have to perform 2 additional labors beyond the initially planned 10, truly ensuring his servitude for the full 12 years. It was Eurystheus's way of extending the boredom and the danger. One quirky tidbit: the Hydra's poisonous blood was so potent that even accidental contact could be fatal, and its venom would later play a tragic role in Hercules' own demise. Historians still argue whether the myth of the Lernaean Hydra symbolizes the challenges of overcoming deeply rooted problems where conventional solutions fail, or if it's simply a testament to the need for cunning and teamwork, even for a demigod. Either way, it was a truly repetitive and exhausting task. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the endless hissing heads of the Lernaean Hydra, constantly regenerating until Hercules and Iolaus found their gruesome, fiery solution. This wasn't just a monster hunt. It was a lesson in persistent, almost maddening repetition, a truly tiresome task for the world's greatest hero. You've just endured the repetitive, venomous battle against the Lernaean Hydra and the petty injustice of Eurystheus's dismissal. Now, with 2 labors down, but only one truly counted, Hercules faces a task that requires not brute force or clever cauterization, but immense patience and tireless pursuit. This brings us to the Nemean Hind elusive deer chase, a long, arduous hunt for a sacred creature that could not be harmed, testing Hercules' endurance and piety rather than his destructive might. Imagine chasing a shimmering, impossibly fast deer across mountains and plains for an entire year. You see, for his third labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to capture the Nemean Hind, a female deer, and bring it back alive to Mycenae. This wasn't a monster to be slain. This was a divine creature sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, wild animals, and the moon. The hind was renowned for its incredible speed, faster than any arrow, and its gleaming golden antlers and bronze hooves made it a breathtaking sight. It lived in Cyrenaica, Arcadia, and its capture required extraordinary skill, not violence, as harming it would incur the terrible wrath of Artemis. This labor was a deliberate test of Hercules' patience and perseverance. Unlike the Nemean Lion or the Hydra, which could be directly confronted, the hind was to be pursued, outwitted, and captured gently. It was a test of his control, his ability to restrain his immense strength, and his respect for the divine. Hercules embarked on what would become a legendary pursuit, a chase that lasted for an entire year. Imagine the sheer mind-numbing tedium of such a hunt. He tracked the hind across vast landscapes, over mountains, through valleys, across rivers, even in some versions to the Hyperborean lands in the far north. He rarely slept, always keeping the elusive hind in sight, constantly pushing his endurance to its limits. He learned the terrain, anticipated its movements, and honed his tracking skills to perfection. This wasn't glorious combat. It was a slow, methodical, utterly exhausting marathon. Finally, after 12 months of relentless pursuit, Hercules cornered the hind. Some versions say he found it resting by a river. Others claim he managed to wound it slightly with an arrow shot between tendon and bone to avoid drawing blood, or net it while it was asleep. The key was to subdue it without killing or severely injuring it, thus avoiding Artemis's wrath. As Hercules was carrying the hind back, he encountered Artemis herself, accompanied by her twin brother, Apollo. The goddess was furious, accusing him of defiling her sacred animal. Hercules, with his characteristic boldness, explained his predicament. He was bound by the decree of the oracle and the commands of Eurystheus, forced into this labor as atonement. He politely but firmly explained that he was simply fulfilling his penance and would return the hind to her care once the labor was complete. Artemis, respecting his sincerity and recognizing the divine forces at play, especially Hera's hand in his trials, accepted his explanation and allowed him to proceed. He was permitted to present the hind to Eurystheus, after which it was released back to Artemis's sanctuary. When he returned to Mycenae with the live hind, Eurystheus, ever the petty taskmaster, tried to claim it for his own menagerie. But Hercules, having just placated a goddess wisely, refused, insisting it must be returned to Artemis, thus fulfilling the spirit of his promise. One quirky tidbit: the Cyrenaean hind was one of the 5 golden-horned hinds sacred to Artemis, often depicted pulling her chariot. Its mythical status made the act of its capture an even greater feat of reverence and skill. Historians still argue whether this labor primarily emphasizes Hercules' physical endurance, his cunning, or his piety and ability to negotiate with divine beings, a quality not often associated with his more boisterous nature. Either way, it was a test of infinite patience, a truly boring and protracted chase. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine Hercules relentlessly tracking a golden-antlered deer across a vast ancient landscape, day after day, week after week, for a whole year. It was a grueling, monotonous pursuit, but one that cemented his legendary patience, even in the face of an endlessly elusive, divine creature. You've just seen Hercules demonstrate extraordinary patience and reverence in his year-long chase of the Nemean Hind. But if that labor tested his restraint, his next task would return him to the familiar territory of confronting a formidable beast, albeit one that required careful planning over sheer brute force. This brings us to the Erymanthian boar. Trapping a beast, a massive, destructive wild boar whose capture demanded cunning and endurance rather than direct combat, leading to another moment of comic terror for the cowardly Eurystheus. Imagine a colossal tusky boar wreaking havoc, and your job is not to kill it, but to bring it back alive. You see, for his fourth labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to capture the Erymanthian boar. This wasn't just any boar you might find rooting around for acorns. This was a gigantic, fearsome creature that terrorized the region of Mount Erymanthos in Arcadia. It was known for its immense size, its razor-sharp tusks, and its destructive rampage tearing up crops, uprooting trees, and terrifying the local populace. The task was not to slay it, but to bring it back alive to Mycenae, a much more challenging feat. Hercules journeyed to Arcadia, where the boar roamed. On his way, he had a brief, unfortunate encounter with the centaurs, a story for another time, but it certainly didn't make his journey any less tedious. Upon arriving at Mount Erymanthos, Hercules set about locating the formidable beast, recognizing that directly confronting such a powerful and dangerous animal in a fight to the death would be unnecessarily risky and also make it impossible to bring it back alive. Hercules opted for a more strategic approach. He decided to use his knowledge of the terrain and the boar's habits. Hercules' strategy involved exhausting the boar and then trapping it. He began by tirelessly pursuing the beast, relentlessly driving it through the deep snows of Mount Erymanthos. Imagine the sheer dull persistence required chasing a massive, angry boar through thick drifts, constantly pushing it higher and higher up the mountain. The boar, though strong, eventually began to tire its movements, becoming slower and more sluggish in the challenging terrain. Finally, Hercules cornered the exhausted boar in a thicket or a snowdrift. As the boar struggled, weakened by the relentless chase and the cold, Hercules, using his immense strength, but with careful control, managed to subdue it. He either wrestled it into submission, tied it up, or simply hoisted it onto his shoulders, a classic image in art, showcasing his incredible power, not just in fighting, but in sheer controlled brute force. The sight of Hercules returning to Mycenae, carrying the enormous live struggling boar on his shoulders, was predictably a source of utter panic for Eurystheus. The cowardly king, upon seeing the formidable beast being presented alive, was so terrified that he immediately scrambled back into his bronze jar, perhaps even deeper than before. He ordered Hercules to get rid of the monstrous animal at once, not caring about its welfare, only his own safety. One quirky tidbit, the image of Hercules carrying the Erymanthian boar on his shoulders, with Eurystheus hiding in a pot, became a popular comedic motif in ancient Greek art and drama, highlighting the absurdity of a mighty hero serving such a pathetic overlord. Historians still argue whether this labor emphasizes the intellectual aspect of Hercules' heroism, using cunning and planning over his raw strength, or if it simply illustrates his complete obedience to Eurystheus' often ridiculous commands, no matter how unglamorous. Either way, it was another tedious task in a long line of them. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture Hercules trudging through deep snow, relentlessly chasing a monstrous boar until he finally lifts its exhausted body onto his broad shoulders. The Erymanthian boar was another test of patience and methodical effort, a truly boring but essential step in his arduous, divinely imposed quest for atonement. You've just seen Hercules' cunning capture of the Erymanthian boar and Eurystheus' predictable fright. But if some labors involved battling fearsome creatures, others presented a challenge of a decidedly more mundane, yet equally monumental nature. This brings us to the Augean stables cleaning up. Messes, a labor that required Hercules to use his intellect and immense strength to solve a seemingly impossible and certainly incredibly filthy task, proving he was more than just a muscle-bound hero. Imagine dealing with decades of accumulated animal waste, a truly Herculean chore. You see, for his fifth labor, Eurystheus, ever scheming to humiliate Hercules, assigned him a task that was not about monster slaying or creature capture, but about sheer disgusting labor. He commanded Hercules to clean the Augean stables in a single day. These weren't just ordinary stables. They belonged to King Augeas of Elis, who possessed the largest herd of cattle in the entire Peloponnese. His stables had reportedly never been cleaned in over 30 years. Imagine the colossal accumulation of dung, literally mountains of it, filling vast courtyards and stalls, creating an unbearable stench and a profound health hazard across the entire region. This task was designed to be not only physically impossible in a single day, but also utterly degrading for a demigod. Hercules arrived at Elis, likely wrinkling his nose at the pervasive stench, long before he even saw the stables. The task seemed impossible by conventional means. No amount of shoveling or carting could clear 30 years of waste from thousands of cattle in just one day. This was a direct challenge to his ingenuity, not just his brawn. Hercules, recognizing the absurdity of attempting to clear the stables by hand, devised a brilliant yet simple plan. He surveyed the landscape, noting the nearby rivers. He then, with his prodigious strength, began to divert the courses of two local rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, by digging immense channels. Imagine him digging these massive trenches, single-handedly reshaping the very landscape with his bare hands or a simple shovel. Once the channels were dug, he redirected the mighty rivers so that their currents flowed directly through the vast stable yards. The rushing waters, with their immense force, then swept through the filthy enclosures, washing away decades of accumulated dung, literally flushing the entire mess into the sea. The stables were completely cleaned, thoroughly and efficiently, all in a single day, just as Eurystheus had commanded. It was a remarkable feat of hydraulic engineering, demonstrating Hercules' problem-solving skills alongside his raw power. However, when Hercules returned to Eurystheus, the cowardly king, infuriated by Hercules' success and finding another petty excuse, declared that this labor did not count. Why? Because Hercules had agreed to be paid for the task by King Augeas, who had promised him 1/10 of his cattle, a promise he later reneged on. Eurystheus argued that since Hercules had performed the labor for payment, not purely as penance, it was invalid. This was another blatant manipulation by Eurystheus, designed to deny Hercules credit and force him to complete yet more tasks. This disqualification meant Hercules would have to perform an additional labor, contributing to the total of 12. One quirky tidbit: the phrase Augean stables has become an idiom in many languages, referring to a huge, difficult, and unpleasant task, especially one involving the cleanup of corruption or negligence. Historians still argue whether this labor was designed to showcase Hercules' intellect over his brawn, or if it was simply another way to publicly humiliate him, making him perform a menial, disgusting chore despite his divine status. Either way, it was a truly boring yet astonishing act of sanitary engineering. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the overwhelming stench and the impossible scale of the Augean stables, and then picture Hercules single-handedly diverting mighty rivers to wash away 30 years of filth. This laborious, ingenious task proved that even the dirtiest problems could be solved by the greatest of heroes, adding another layer to the monotonous series of his great deeds. You've just seen Hercules outwit his taskmaster by turning a river into a giant cleaning crew for the Augean stables, only to have the labor dismissed. Now, with yet another task ahead, Hercules faces a different kind of menace, not a roaring lion or a regenerating serpent, but a flock of terrifying metallic birds. This brings us to the Stymphalian bird's feathered menace, a labor that required Hercules to innovate using sound rather than direct combat to dispatch a deadly winged horde. Imagine a sky darkened by a flock of birds whose feathers were like bronze arrows and whose beaks could pierce armor. You see, for his sixth labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to drive away the Stymphalian birds. These were no ordinary birds. They were monstrous, man-eating birds with beaks of bronze claws like iron and sharp metallic feathers that they could shoot like arrows. They resided in the dense, gloomy swamps around Lake Stymphalia in Arcadia, where they multiplied rapidly, devastating local crops, attacking livestock, and even preying on human beings. Their sheer numbers and their deadly nature made the region uninhabitable and dangerous. Hercules journeyed to Lake Stymphalia, a place of dread and misery. He quickly realized that his usual methods of combat were impractical against such a numerous airborne foe. He couldn't simply club or wrestle thousands of flying, arrow-shooting birds. His arrows, though now tipped with hydra venom, were too slow and limited against a flock. Direct engagement would be suicidal. Once again, Hercules needed to use his wits. The goddess Athena, always a patron of heroes and often a source of divine aid, provided him with a clever solution. She gave him a pair of large bronze rattles, or clappers, forged by Hephaestus, the divine smith. These weren't just ordinary noisemakers. They were incredibly loud, designed to produce a terrifying cacophony. Hercules then climbed to a high point overlooking the swamp, perhaps a nearby mountain. He then began to vigorously shake the bronze rattles. Imagine the ear-splitting clamor that erupted, echoing across the swamp, a sound so unbearable and alien that it terrified the birds. The noise was so immense and persistent that it drove the Stymphalian birds into a frantic panic. The terrified birds, unable to bear the overwhelming noise, flew up from the swamp in massive, confused flocks, desperate to escape the unbearable din. As they rose into the air in a dense mass, Hercules then took up his bow, and using his arrows now tipped with the hydra's deadly venom, a useful callback, he shot down hundreds or even thousands of them as they flew. He didn't have to chase them. They were driven to him by the sound. While he couldn't kill every single one, he decimated their numbers and drove the remaining birds away from Lake Stymphalia, dispersing them permanently. The region was finally freed from their menace. When he returned to Eurystheus, the cowardly king, likely still hiding, could do little but acknowledge the success of this ingenious labor. This task proved that Hercules' heroism was not just about brute strength, but also about tactical thinking and the effective use of strategic tools. One quirky tidbit: some versions of the myth imply that Hercules himself made the bronze clappers, or that they were given to him by the Argonauts. Regardless of their origin, the emphasis on using sound to flush out the birds is a consistent and unique detail of this labor. Historians still argue whether this myth is a commentary on early forms of pest control, or if it symbolizes the triumph of intellect and strategic thinking over an overwhelming, seemingly insurmountable problem. Either way, it was an incredibly noisy and probably quite tedious day for Hercules. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture Hercules high on a mountain, shaking immense bronze rattles, driving a screeching feathered horde into the sky, then raining down venom-tipped arrows. The Stymphalian birds were a unique challenge, reminding us that even the greatest heroes sometimes just need a really loud noise to get the job done, bringing another step closer to his boring yet legendary atonement. You've just watched Hercules outwit the Stymphalian birds with bronze clappers, a clever solution for an airborne menace. Now, with 6 labors behind him, even if Eurystheus is still trying to cheat him, Hercules faces a challenge that, while not involving a monstrous regenerating creature, requires the capture of a magnificent wild beast of immense power and ferocity. This brings us to the Cretan bull, a royal beast, a labor that would take Hercules to a distant island and pit him against a creature of divine origin, showcasing his strength not in slaying, but in subduing. Imagine having to lasso a creature of immense power, a bull worthy of the gods, and bring it back alive. You see, for his 7th labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to capture the Cretan bull. This was no ordinary farm animal. This was a splendid wild bull, snow white, of immense size and terrifying strength that was terrorizing the island of Crete. Its origin was divine. It was either the bull that Poseidon sent to King Minos of Crete, and which Minos failed to sacrifice, incurring Poseidon's wrath, or the very bull that carried Europa across the sea. Regardless of its exact lineage, it was a creature of incredible power and destructive rage, breathing fire in some accounts. Hercules journeyed to Crete, an island far from mainland Greece. Upon his arrival, he sought out King Minos. Minos, perhaps weary of the bull's destructive rampages that had plagued his island for years, was actually quite willing to let Hercules capture it. He even offered Hercules help, but Hercules, ever confident in his own abilities, chose to tackle the task alone. This was a challenge not of cunning strategy against a regenerating foe, but of sheer, unadulterated strength and wrestling prowess against an incredibly powerful animal. Hercules tracked the bull through the wilds of Crete. Imagine the powerful beast crashing through forests, bellowing defiantly, its hooves tearing up the earth. Hercules engaged the bull in a titanic struggle, not with weapons, but with his bare hands and immense physical strength, much like his first encounter with the Nemean Lion. This was a wrestling match of epic proportions, man against beast, muscle against muscle. He grappled with the formidable bull, exerting all his superhuman might. He wrestled it to the ground, perhaps by seizing its horns or by throwing a rope around its neck, and finally managed to subdue it through sheer force. He broke its spirit, not its body, bending the wild beast to his will. Once subdued, he didn't slay it. Instead, in another testament to his strength, he mounted the bull and rode it all the way across the Aegean Sea back to the Peloponnese. Imagine riding a colossal, subdued bull across vast stretches of open water, a truly bizarre and incredibly tiring journey. Upon his return to Mycenae, Hercules triumphantly presented the Cretan bull to Eurystheus. The cowardly king, however, was as terrified of this live, massive beast as he was of Hercules himself. He promptly refused to keep it, perhaps fearing its destructive power, or simply Hercules' ability to bring such a creature back. Eurystheus, in his usual fashion, attempted to dedicate the bull to Hera, but Hera, ever spiteful towards Hercules, refused the offering. The bull was eventually released and continued its destructive rampage, making its way to Marathon, where it would later be captured by Theseus. So another labor completed, another grand beast brought back, and another act of futility for Hercules as Eurystheus continued his petty games. One quirky tidbit: the Cretan bull is often seen as the father of the Minotaur, as it was with this very bull that Pasiphae, Minos' wife, famously mated after Poseidon's curse. This ties the labor into an even larger web of Greek myth. Historians still argue whether this labor primarily showcases Hercules' physical prowess and his ability to subdue rather than simply destroy, or if its purpose was to set up the bull for future heroic narratives by other figures like Theseus. Either way, it was a very long ride. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture Hercules wrestling a magnificent, fire-breathing bull, and then, inexplicably, riding it across the vast open sea. The Cretan bull was a spectacular, yet undoubtedly exhausting diversion, bringing Hercules one step closer to the end of his monotonous, divinely imposed penance. You've just watched Hercules wrestle and ride the magnificent Cretan bull across the Aegean, another impressive feat dismissed by his cowardly cousin. But if capturing a powerful animal was challenging, his next labor introduced him to a far more disturbing and truly monstrous kind of creature: flesh-eating horses. This brings us to the mares of Diomedes. Flesh-eating horses, a grim and brutal task that plunged Hercules into a world of unchecked barbarity, demanding not just strength, but an iron will and a grim resolution. Imagine trying to herd horses that crave human flesh. You see, for his eighth labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to capture the mares of Diomedes and bring them back to Mycenae. These were no ordinary horses. They belonged to King Diomedes of Thrace, a son of Ares, the god of war, who was known for his barbaric and cruel practices. Diomedes fed his horses human flesh, specifically that of strangers who were shipwrecked or captured in his kingdom. These four mares, Podargos, the swift, Lampon, the shining, Xanthos, the yellow, and Dinos, the terrible, were enormous, wild, untamable, and perpetually ravenous for human meat, making them truly terrifying. Hercules journeyed to Thrace, to the grim stables of King Diomedes. He quickly understood that this was not a task for gentle persuasion or cunning traps, but for direct confrontation with extreme savagery. The challenge was multifaceted: subduing the brutal king, capturing the feral horses, and then transporting them all without becoming their next meal. There are varying accounts of how Hercules initially dealt with Diomedes and his mares. Some versions say Hercules brought his companion Abderus, who was unfortunately devoured by the mares when Hercules left him to guard them, prompting Hercules to build the city of Abdera in his honor. More commonly, Hercules first engaged King Diomedes himself in battle. After a fierce struggle, Hercules defeated and killed the cruel king. In a grim act of poetic justice, Hercules then fed Diomedes' own body to his carnivorous horses. Imagine the grotesque scene, the mares finally sated on the flesh of their former master, became more docile. This act of feeding them their owner's flesh, while horrific, apparently broke their wild man-eating spirit, making them manageable. Once they were subdued, Hercules was able to lead them away from Thrace. The journey back to Mycenae was still incredibly challenging. Even sated, these were still powerful wild horses. Hercules had to herd them across great distances, ensuring they remained under control. This was a tedious, arduous task, constantly demanding vigilance. Upon his return, Hercules presented the mares of Diomedes to Eurystheus. The cowardly king, once again terrified by the sight of such fearsome, albeit now docile beasts, refused to keep them. He ordered them to be released. The mares were eventually set free on Mount Olympus, where they lost their taste for human flesh and were eventually devoured by wild animals or by their divine counterparts. One quirky tidbit: the grim nature of feeding Diomedes to his own horses is often presented as a just punishment for his barbarity, a testament to Hercules' role as an enforcer of divine justice, even through brutal means. Historians still argue whether this labor primarily highlights Hercules' raw strength and capacity for violence, or his grim dedication to completing even the most morally challenging and distasteful tasks set before him. It was certainly a test of his resolve against pure savagery. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the monstrous flesh-eating mares of Diomedes, their eyes burning with hunger, and Hercules' grim determination to subdue them, even by feeding them their cruel master. This was a truly dark and unsettling chapter in his arduous atonement, bringing him ever closer to the end of his divinely imposed, yet endlessly repetitive labors. You've just borne witness to the grim and brutal tale of the mares of Diomedes, a labor that tested Hercules' resolve against pure savagery. But if that task was about confronting animalistic cruelty, his next challenge would take him into a realm of fierce, independent warriors and a quest for a symbolic garment. This brings us to Hippolyta's girdle. Amazonian encounter, a labor that would involve a journey to the distant land of the Amazons, and a potentially peaceful, but ultimately violent confrontation for a coveted item of power. Imagine sailing to the edge of the known world to demand an article of clothing from a queen of formidable female warriors. You see, for his ninth labor, Eurystheus, responding to a request from his daughter Admete, who greatly admired the item, commanded Hercules to obtain the magical girdle of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. The Amazons were a legendary race of fierce, independent female warriors living in a matriarchal society often located in the region of Themyscira on the coast of the Black Sea. Their very existence challenged Greek patriarchal norms, making a confrontation with them particularly intriguing. Hippolyta's girdle was not just any belt. It was a golden girdle, a gift from Ares, the god of war, symbolizing her authority, her military prowess, and her queenly power. To obtain it was to symbolically strip the Amazon queen of her very essence, or at least her most potent emblem. Hercules embarked on this journey, sometimes accompanied by companions like Theseus, sailing across the Aegean Sea to the remote lands of the Amazons. Upon arriving in Themyscira, the initial encounter with Hippolyta was surprisingly peaceful. Hippolyta, hearing of Hercules' fame and strength, and perhaps even impressed by him, was reportedly quite willing to give him the girdle voluntarily. She recognized his legendary status and seemed open to a diplomatic exchange. Imagine for a moment a labor that might actually be resolved without bloodshed. However, Hera, the ever-watchful and vindictive goddess, could not tolerate this easy success for her hated stepson. She was not about to let Hercules complete a labor without immense suffering or conflict. Disguising herself as an Amazonian warrior, Hera spread a false rumor among the Amazon ranks, whispering that Hercules and his companions were planning to kidnap their queen. This insidious rumor immediately sparked chaos and outrage among the fierce Amazon warriors. They swiftly armed themselves and attacked Hercules and his men. The peaceful negotiation was shattered, replaced by a brutal and unavoidable battle. Imagine Hercules caught off guard, suddenly fighting for his life against a horde of highly skilled, ferocious female warriors. Hercules, in the heat of battle, and believing Hippolyta had betrayed him by orchestrating the attack, quickly slew her to obtain the girdle. It was a tragic misunderstanding, a consequence of Hera's relentless meddling. He then fought his way through the remaining Amazons, eventually securing the golden girdle. He retrieved it from the fallen queen's body and began his long journey back to Mycenae. When he returned and presented the girdle to Eurystheus the king, as usual, simply accepted the proof of the completed labor, likely not caring about the nuances of the fierce battle or Hera's meddling. The labor was deemed complete, another impossible task overcome. One quirky tidbit about the Amazons: they were often depicted as having one breast removed or seared off to allow for easier use of a bow and arrow. Though this is likely a later fantastical misconception rather than historical fact. Historians still argue whether the myth of Hippolyta's girdle primarily serves to highlight Hercules' strength against formidable female warriors, or if it is a cautionary tale about divine manipulation and the tragic consequences of misunderstanding in wartime. Either way, it was a long journey and a bloody acquisition for a mere belt. So as you drift towards sleep, picture Hercules sailing to a distant land, hoping for a peaceful exchange, only to be plunged into battle by a vengeful goddess. The quest for Hippolyta's girdle was another arduous and ultimately violent step in his long, monotonous road to atonement, a heavy golden emblem of Hera's unrelenting malice. You've just seen Hercules' tragic, Hera-orchestrated battle for Hippolyta's girdle, a seemingly simple task turned violent. Now his labors will take him to the very edge of the known world, beyond the pillars of Hercules, to confront a monstrous, multi-bodied giant and embark on a monumental cattle drive. This brings us to Geryon's cattle journey to the west, a labor demanding not just strength in combat, but incredible endurance for a long, arduous trek and resilience against the scorching heat of the sun. Imagine driving thousands of cattle across continents, all guarded by a truly bizarre, three-bodied monstrosity. You see, for his 10th labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to bring him the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a fearsome giant described as having 3 bodies, 3 heads, and 6 arms and legs, or sometimes as 3 separate bodies joined at the waist. He lived on the mythical island of Erythea, meaning Red Island, located far in the west, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, which would later be called the Pillars of Hercules in his honor. Geryon owned a magnificent herd of red cattle, guarded by a 2-headed dog named Orthrus, brother of Cerberus, and the Lernaean Hydra, thanks to Echidna, mother of monsters, and a herdsman named Eurytion. Hercules embarked on this immense journey, arguably one of his most geographically challenging labors. He had to travel all the way to the westernmost reaches of the Mediterranean, a journey that tested his endurance even before he reached his destination. To cross the vast ocean, he famously borrowed the golden cup, or bowl of Helios, the sun god, which the sun used to travel from west to east each night after completing its daytime journey. Imagine sailing across the vast, shimmering sea in a giant golden drinking cup. This magical vessel allowed him to reach Erythea. Upon arrival, Hercules immediately faced the guardians of the cattle. He swiftly dispatched the herdsman Eurytion and the formidable 2-headed dog Orthrus. Then he confronted Geryon himself. Despite Geryon's monstrous multi-bodied form and his formidable weaponry, he could wield 3 spears and 3 shields simultaneously. Hercules, with his immense strength and deadly Hydra-poisoned arrows, managed to overcome the giant, slaying him in a fierce battle. With Geryon and his guardians defeated, Hercules then gathered the vast herd of red cattle. But the labor was far from over. He now had to drive these thousands of cattle all the way back to Mycenae, across continents and vast stretches of land. This was an epic cattle drive, fraught with challenges. The long trek. Imagine the sheer boredom and physical exhaustion of herding thousands of animals over thousands of miles day after day for months on end. Loss and recapture. Along the way, cattle inevitably wandered off, were stolen, or got lost, forcing Hercules to track them down and recapture them, adding to the tedium. Local challenges. He encountered various obstacles and local brigands who tried to steal the cattle, forcing him into numerous skirmishes and diversions. Hera's continued malice. Hera predictably continued to hinder him, sending gadflies to sting the cattle, causing them to scatter, or flooding rivers to impede his progress. This long, exhausting return journey proved to be one of the most arduous parts of the labor, requiring incredible patience, perseverance, and constant vigilance. When he finally returned to Mycenae with the surviving cattle, Eurystheus, likely astounded that Hercules had even returned from such a distant land, accepted the cattle and sacrificed them to Hera. This labor was definitively completed, pushing Hercules closer to his freedom. One quirky tidbit, the journey to Gerion's island and back, is often cited as the origin of the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, which he supposedly created or marked as a boundary during his travels to the far west. Historians still argue whether this labor primarily symbolizes the civilizing of wild lands, the challenges of long-distance trade, or simply the extraordinary endurance required to achieve a seemingly impossible task of logistics and persistence. Either way, it was a very long, very boring cattle drive. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture Hercules sailing in a golden cup to the edge of the world, fighting a three-bodied giant, and then spending months, if not a year, relentlessly herding thousands of red cattle across ancient landscapes. The cattle of Geryon was a monumental undertaking, reminding us that even heroism can involve an immense amount of tedious physical labor, drawing him closer to his well-earned rest. You've just watched Hercules embark on an epic, utterly exhausting cattle drive from the far west, successfully delivering Geryon's prized herd to his cowardly cousin. With 10 labors now complete, including the 2 Eurystheus tried to dismiss Hercules faces, what seems like a simple, almost poetic task, but one shrouded in cosmic significance and guarded by ancient, formidable beings. This brings us to the Apples of the Hesperides, a cosmic task, a quest for mythical golden fruits, which would require Hercules to travel to the very edge of the world, outwit divine beings, and even briefly shoulder the weight of the heavens. Imagine seeking apples that glow like sunlight, guarded by a 100-headed dragon and the Titan who holds up the sky. You see, for his 11th labor, Eurystheus, likely desperate to find a task truly beyond Hercules' reach, commanded him to bring back some golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. These were no ordinary apples. They were sacred golden fruits that granted immortality given by Gaia Earth to Hera as a wedding gift when she married Zeus. They grew on a special tree in a mystical garden located at the westernmost edge of the world near the Atlas Mountains. The garden was guarded by the Hesperides nymphs, who were daughters of evening, and most importantly by Ladon, a fearsome 100-headed dragon that never slept. Hercules embarked on this immense journey, which was perhaps more about intellect diplomacy and enduring divine challenges than direct combat. The precise location of the garden was a secret, so Hercules first had to find out where it was. This involved a series of encounters. He wrestled the sea god Nereus, the old man of the sea, to force him to reveal the location of the garden. He traveled through Libya, where he encountered the giant Antaeus, who gained strength from touching the earth. Hercules defeated him by holding him aloft, preventing him from touching the ground until he was crushed. He freed Prometheus the Titan, chained to a rock, for giving fire to humanity by slaying the eagle that gnawed at his liver daily. In return, Prometheus advised Hercules to seek the aid of Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold up the sky. Hercules eventually reached the garden. Confronting Ladon, the 100-headed dragon, was a formidable challenge. In some versions, Hercules managed to slay Ladon, perhaps with an arrow, but the more famous and intriguing version of this labor involves his encounter with Atlas. Imagine Atlas, the colossal Titan, burdened for eternity, with the immense weight of the celestial sphere on his shoulders. Hercules, approaching him, proposed a cunning plan. He offered to take Atlas's burden for a short time, if Atlas would go and fetch the golden apples for him. Atlas, weary of his eternal task, eagerly agreed. So Hercules, with his immense strength, took the sky upon his own broad shoulders. Imagine the incredible weight, the sheer crushing burden of holding up the entire heavens. It was a momentary yet profound act of titanic strength and cosmic significance. Atlas, now free, for the first time in millennia, went into the garden easily, bypassed Ladon, who was either his son or simply known to him, and plucked the golden apples. Atlas returned, clutching the apples and feeling the sweet freedom of not holding. The sky tried to trick Hercules. He offered to deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself, planning to leave Hercules forever burdened with the sky. But Hercules, always clever, saw through the ruse. He politely agreed, but asked Atlas if he would just take the sky back for a moment, so Hercules could adjust his lion skin padding on his shoulders. Atlas, unsuspecting, resumed his burden. Hercules then quickly grabbed the golden apples and with a sly farewell left Atlas once again holding the heavens for eternity. He returned to Mycenae with the golden apples, presenting them to Eurystheus. The king, terrified of these sacred divine objects, didn't know what to do with them. They were eventually returned to Athena, who took them back to the garden of the Hesperides. One quirky tidbit: the image of Hercules holding up the sky is one of the most iconic in Greek mythology, sometimes even mistakenly attributed to Atlas alone. Historians still argue whether this labor primarily showcases Hercules' incredible strength, his cunning intellect in outwitting Atlas, or his cosmic significance in being able to briefly bear the weight of the heavens, a truly divine feat. Either way, it was a very long journey, a weighty burden, and a clever trick. So, as you drift towards sleep, picture Hercules literally holding up the sky, then outwitting the weary Titan for glowing golden apples. The apples of the Hesperides was a cosmic task, bringing him to the very edge of existence, preparing him for the final terrifying descent into the realm of the dead. You've just seen Hercules, through sheer strength and cunning, briefly shoulder the weight of the heavens and trick Atlas into retrieving the golden apples of the Hesperides. With 11 impossible tasks now completed. Eurystheus, likely gnashing his teeth in frustration, finally devises a labor so terrifying, so seemingly insurmountable, that he believes it will surely be Hercules' last. This brings us to Cerberus, guardian of the underworld, the final most terrifying labor which required Hercules to descend into the realm of the dead and confront its monstrous, multi-headed watchdog. Imagine facing a beast that guarded the very gates of Hades, ensuring no living soul could enter or leave. You see, for his 12th and final labor, Eurystheus commanded Hercules to bring him Cerberus, the fearsome, monstrous hound that guarded the entrance to the underworld. This was a task designed for ultimate impossibility and certain death. Cerberus was often depicted as a colossal dog with 3 heads, a mane of snakes, a serpent's tail, and lion's claws. His bark was said to echo like thunder, and his presence alone struck terror into the hearts of both living and dead. His purpose was absolute, to prevent the dead from escaping Hades, and more crucially for Hercules to prevent the living from entering. Hercules knew that this labor was different. It wasn't about slaying a monster in the mortal world or gathering a herd. It was about confronting death itself, venturing into the forbidden realm of the dead. For this journey, he needed special preparation. He first went to Eleusis and underwent the Eleusinian Mysteries sacred rites that purified him and initiated him into the secrets of the underworld, making him fit to walk among the dead and return. This ritual highlights the profound spiritual danger of the task. With his preparations complete, Hercules descended into the underworld. The exact entrance varies in myths, sometimes through a cave at Tyanarum in Laconia, or through a chasm near Heraclea Pontica. Imagine him walking through the shadowy, desolate landscape past the ghosts of the dead, across the river Styx, guided by Charon the ferryman, whom he sometimes forced to take him. He encountered various shades, including those of Meleager and Medusa. But his focus was singular, the monstrous guardian. Finally, he reached the very gates of Hades, guarded by Cerberus. Hercules did not immediately resort to violence. Instead, he first sought permission from Hades himself, the grim lord of the underworld. Hades, knowing Hercules' divine lineage and incredible strength, reportedly agreed to let Hercules take Cerberus, but only on one condition: Hercules had to subdue the beast without the use of any weapons. This was a test of raw, unadulterated strength and courage, a testament to his ability to conquer even the most terrifying forces with his bare hands. Imagine Hercules grappling with the 3-headed Cerberus, the monstrous dog, snarling, biting its snake mane, hissing, its claws tearing. Hercules, protected by his Nemean Lion skin, a crucial callback, wrestled with the terrifying guardian, using his immense strength to pin its multiple heads, eventually subduing the beast by sheer force, perhaps choking it until it became docile from lack of oxygen, or simply overpowering its immense strength. It was a brutal, silent struggle that required every ounce of his legendary power and endurance. Once Cerberus was subdued, Hercules chained it and dragged the monstrous hound, snarling and drooling, through the passages of the underworld, back up to the light of the mortal world. Imagine the terror of Eurystheus when Hercules presented the living, albeit temporarily subdued Cerberus at Mycenae. The cowardly king, utterly petrified by the sight of the infernal beast, probably leaped into his bronze jar for the last time, and frantically begged Hercules to return it to the underworld immediately. Hercules, having completed his impossible task, finally returned Cerberus to its post, its sacred duty fulfilled. One quirky tidbit, the foam from Cerberus's mouth, as Hercules dragged him from the underworld, was said to have spawned the poisonous aconite wolfsbane plant, tying the myth directly to the natural world. Historians still argue whether this labor primarily symbolizes the hero's ultimate triumph over death, his journey through the subconscious, or simply the culmination of all his previous trials, requiring both physical might and spiritual fortitude. Either way, it was an incredibly grim and terrifying finale. So, as you prepare to cross into your own personal realm of unconsciousness, imagine Hercules wrestling the terrifying three-headed Cerberus barehanded, dragging it from the depths of Hades. This final, most daunting labor brought him face to face with ultimate fear, and in overcoming it, finally earned him the liberation he so desperately sought, and with it, a well-deserved, boring, eternal rest among the gods. You've just borne witness to the terrifying culmination of Hercules' servitude, his bare-handed subduing of Cerberus, the monstrous hound of Hades. With this final, most impossible labor completed, the decree from the Oracle of Delphi was fulfilled. The tyrannical commands of Eurystheus were at an end. This brings us to the aftermath, freedom and further adventures, detailing Hercules' long-awaited release from his penance, and the subsequent often equally grand deeds that cemented his ultimate divine status, even though our boring focus on the labors is nearly complete. Imagine the relief, the sense of liberation after 12 years of relentless, life-threatening tasks. You see, upon successfully returning Cerberus to the underworld and reporting to Eurystheus, who no doubt was utterly speechless and still trembling, Hercules was finally freed from his servitude. The curse inflicted by Hera had been endured, the terrible atonement for his past actions completed. The promise of immortality given by the oracle now awaited him. This moment marked a profound shift. He was no longer a slave to his cousin's whims, but a hero, truly in command of his own destiny, albeit one still deeply entangled with the gods. However, Hercules' life was rarely quiet, even after his labors. His immense strength and heroic nature meant he was constantly drawn into further adventures, helping others, fighting injustice, and battling new monsters. These post-labor feats are numerous, and often just as impressive as the 12. The Argonauts Hercules famously joined Jason and the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece, though in most versions he left the expedition early to search for his lost companion, Hylas. This highlights his continued readiness for grand adventures. The Trojan War. Earlier conflict, before the famous Trojan War with Achilles, Hercules actually sacked Troy himself, attacking King Laomedon for reneging on a promise. This shows his sense of justice and willingness to challenge even kings. Further, monster slaying. He continued to rid the world of various dangers like the giant Alcyoneus, the bandit Cacus, and countless others. His reputation as a monster slayer only grew. Establishing cults and games. He founded cities, established sacred games, like the Olympic Games in some traditions, and inaugurated cults, further cementing his heroic legacy and connection to civic life. Marriages and tragedies. His personal life, however, continued to be tumultuous. He married Deianira, a union that tragically led to his eventual downfall, thanks to the poisoned shirt of Nessus the centaur, a painful callback to his earlier Hydra venom-tipped arrows and the centaur encounter. Even in freedom, Hera's influence, or simply the tragic nature of his destiny, lingered. His ultimate destiny, as promised by the oracle, was apotheosis, his ascension to Mount Olympus to live among the gods. After his painful death caused by the poisoned shirt, his mortal half perished, but his immortal divine essence ascended. He was welcomed onto Olympus, reconciled with Hera, or at least she ceased her active persecution and even married Hebe, the goddess of youth. This was the true culmination of his grueling labors, a final, eternal peace after a life of immense suffering and tireless effort. One quirky tidbit about his apotheosis: the Roman cult of Hercules became incredibly popular, often depicting him as a benevolent protector of merchants and travelers, and a symbol of success through hard work. This shows how his image evolved from a suffering hero to a more generalized symbol of virtue. Historians still argue whether the later tales of Hercules' post-labor adventures were additions designed to provide more narratives for a popular hero, or if they were integral parts of his legend, from early on, showcasing that heroism is a lifelong endeavor, not just a series of tasks. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine Hercules, finally unburdened by Eurystheus' commands, embarking on new adventures, and ultimately ascending to Mount Olympus to find eternal rest among the gods. His freedom, hard-won and well-deserved, was not an end to his legendary deeds, but a new chapter in a life of endless heroism culminating in the most boringly peaceful slumber imaginable for a demigod. You've just witnessed Hercules' arduous journey culminate in his long-awaited freedom and eventual apotheosis among the gods. But beyond the fantastical monsters and divine interventions, Hercules himself as a character embodies a deeply human paradox. This brings us to heroism and humanity. Hercules' complex nature, reflecting on his unique blend of unparalleled divine strength and profoundly relatable mortal flaws, making him one of the most enduring, yet at times exasperating figures in Greek mythology. Imagine a godlike being who could strangle lions, but also succumb to a fiery temper or overwhelming grief. You see, Hercules is not a perfect hero. Unlike the cunning Odysseus or the noble Achilles, Hercules is often portrayed as raw, unfiltered power, sometimes guided by intellect, but just as often by instinct and emotion. This blend of the divine and the decidedly human makes him incredibly compelling, but also paradoxically quite boring in his repetitive flaws. Consider his divine strength. From crushing snakes in his crib to single-handedly diverting rivers, lifting the sky, and subduing a three-headed hellhound, Hercules' physical might is unmatched. He embodies the sheer brute force of heroism, making the impossible merely difficult. This strength is a gift from Zeus, a mark of his divine parentage, setting him apart from all other mortals. He could literally move mountains, a truly godlike capability. Yet, this immense strength is often paired with profound mortal flaws. Fiery temper. Hercules is notorious for his explosive rage. His initial tragedy, the slaying of his family, was a direct result of a divinely induced madness, but even without Hera's influence, he was prone to bouts of uncontrollable anger. He might kill in a fit of pique, such as his music teacher Linus, or simply lash out violently when frustrated. This impulsiveness often led to unintended consequences and further sorrow. Impulsiveness and lack of foresight, while capable of great cunning, like with the Hydra or Atlas, he could also be surprisingly naive or prone to acting before thinking. He falls for simple tricks or plunges into situations without fully considering the repercussions, leading to unnecessary struggles. Excess and revelry. Hercules was known for his prodigious appetites for food, drink, and women. He was often portrayed as a heavy drinker, sometimes leading to embarrassing or violent incidents. This human tendency towards excess contrasts sharply with his disciplined, laborious quests. Imagine a hero who could save the world one day and then embarrass himself at a drinking party the next. Suffering and grief. Despite his strength, he experienced profound human suffering, the unbearable guilt over his family, the humiliation of his servitude, the pain of betrayal. His capacity for immense physical feats was matched by his capacity for immense emotional pain, making him surprisingly relatable in his struggles. This complex interplay between godlike power and very human weaknesses is what makes Hercules enduring. He is not a flawless ideal, but a hero who struggles, falters, and often pays a heavy price for his impulsiveness, even as he achieves unparalleled greatness. His heroism is often born out of his flaws and the suffering they cause, forcing him into a cycle of atonement and redemption. One quirky tidbit despite his temper and mishaps. Hercules was widely venerated throughout Greece and Rome, often seen as a patron of athletes, protectors against evil, and a symbol of triumphant perseverance through hardship. His flaws made him accessible, and his ultimate triumph offered hope. Historians still argue whether the Greeks intentionally crafted Hercules with such human flaws to make him more relatable to mortals, or if his character simply evolved over centuries of storytelling, reflecting different cultural values at different times. Either way, his imperfect humanity is as compelling as his divine strength. So, as you drift towards sleep, consider Hercules the demigod, who could clean impossible stables and wrestle literal death, yet was haunted by his own temper and capable of tragic mistakes. His blend of raw heroism and relatable humanity makes his story enduringly fascinating, but also profoundly boring in its repetitive cycle of glory, struggle, and eventual hard-won peace. You've just pondered the complex blend of godlike strength and human frailty that defined Hercules, making him a hero who, despite his epic deeds, was profoundly relatable. This very complexity and the nature of his 12 arduous tasks has given rise to an enduring concept that transcends ancient Greek mythology, becoming a universal symbol for seemingly insurmountable challenges. This brings us to the enduring legacy of labors, discussing how Hercules' tasks have come to symbolize impossible, monumental efforts, forever etched into our language and collective imagination. Imagine facing a task so overwhelming, so seemingly unachievable, that you instinctively call it Herculean. You see, the phrase Herculean task is now a common idiom in many languages, used to describe any undertaking that requires immense strength, courage, perseverance, and often ingenuity, seemingly beyond the capacity of an ordinary person. This isn't just a casual saying, it's a direct linguistic inheritance from the myth of Hercules' 12 labors. The very difficulty and repetition of his challenges made them the ultimate benchmark for overwhelming efforts. Consider why these specific labors, out of all the Greek myths, captured the imagination so profoundly. Scale of the challenges. From a seemingly unkillable lion to a regenerating hydra, from a continent-spanning cattle drive to cleaning decades of filth, each labor presented a challenge that was literally larger than life. They were physical, logistical, and often existential impossibilities for any mere mortal. Repetitive difficulty. The sheer number of labors and the fact that Eurystheus continually tried to add more or dismiss completed ones emphasized the grinding, repetitive nature of Hercules' atonement. It wasn't just one heroic act, but a sustained, monotonous period of extreme effort. This repetition, while perhaps boring to recount, reinforced the idea of unrelenting struggle. Variety of challenges. The labors weren't all just monster fights. They included intellectual challenges, the Hydra Augean stables, Atlas tests of endurance, Nemean Hind, Geryon's cattle, moral dilemmas, Mares of Diomedes, and spiritual journeys, Cerberus. This variety showed that Herculean effort wasn't just about brawn, but about a full spectrum of human and demigod capabilities, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Some labors were grand battles, but others were surprisingly mundane, like cleaning stables. This blend of the epic and the prosaic made the labor aspect relatable, even for ordinary human efforts. The enduring power of this legacy lies in its universal resonance. Everyone at some point faces a personal Herculean task, whether it's completing a daunting project at work, overcoming a serious illness, raising challenging children, or simply getting through a particularly difficult week. The myth of Hercules' labors provides a cultural archetype for these struggles, a framework for understanding and articulating monumental effort. One quirky tidbit about this legacy: Hercules' image, often depicted with his club and lion skin, became a popular symbol of strength and perseverance throughout history, from ancient Roman emperors who wished to associate themselves with his power to Renaissance art and even to modern strongman competitions. Historians still argue whether the lasting impact of the 12 labors stems from their allegorical potential, representing the struggles of life, their sheer entertainment value, or their utility as a moral framework for perseverance in the face of impossible odds. It's likely a powerful combination of all three. So, as you drift towards sleep, consider the simple power of a phrase like Herculean effort. It carries within it the echoes of a lion strangled, a hydra subdued by fire, stables cleaned by rivers, and the very sky briefly held aloft. Hercules' labors were more than just ancient myths. They became a timeless testament to the extraordinary capacity for perseverance within the human spirit, even when faced with the most daunting and often utterly boring of tasks. You've explored the enduring legacy of Hercules' labors, seeing how his impossible tasks have etched themselves into our very language as symbols of monumental effort. We've journeyed through his tragic birth, his furious goddess, his cowardly king, and the relentless series of challenges that defined his life. Now, as our exploration of this mighty hero draws to its peaceful conclusion, it's time for Hercules, and for you to experience the true culmination of all that relentless toil, resting after heroic deeds, an invitation to peaceful, well-earned slumber, recognizing that even the greatest heroes eventually find their ultimate peace. Imagine Hercules finally free from the servitude to Eurystheus, his labors complete, his soul purified, and his eventual place among the gods secured. After a life of perpetual struggle, of battling monsters, undertaking impossible journeys, and enduring immense suffering, his ultimate reward is profound peace. His apotheosis on Mount Olympus, where he is welcomed by Zeus and even reconciled with Hera, signifies not just immortality, but an eternal repose, a permanent cessation of the grueling efforts that defined his mortal existence. For a hero whose life was characterized by continuous, almost monotonous acts of immense physical exertion and emotional turmoil, the concept of true rest, of lasting peace, would have been the most coveted prize. He had wrestled the Nemean Lion only to face the regenerating Hydra. He had cleaned mountains of filth only to capture flesh-eating mares. The cycle was endless, the demands relentless. But now, as a god, he enters a realm of divine leisure, where his strength can be used for nobler, less burdensome pursuits, or simply for quiet contemplation. The myth of Hercules, with its relentless series of tasks, reminds us that even the greatest achievements are built upon immense effort, and that effort, no matter how glorious, is tiring. It's a testament to the human and demigod need for respite, for recovery, for the restoration that only profound rest can bring. His final piece is not merely an ending, but a celebration of a life lived to its absolute fullest, a well-deserved calm after the storm of his epic deeds. Think of the vastness of that rest. No more angry lions, no more hydra heads sprouting, no more filthy stables to clean, or wild horses to tame. No more terrifying journeys to the underworld. Just the peaceful, eternal calm of Olympus, where the nectar flows, the ambrosia sustains, and the anxieties of mortal life are forever banished. It is the ultimate, profoundly boring, yet utterly desirable sleep. One quirky thought as we finish, perhaps, even on Olympus, Hercules still occasionally dreams. But if he does, they are likely not the dreams of challenge and conflict, but serene visions of fields of poppies, or the tranquil murmur of a celestial river Lethe, finally free from the relentless cycle of trials. His dreams for once would truly be boring, perfectly peaceful, and utterly restorative. So, as the sounds of the ancient world fade into the quiet hum of your own room, let the immense efforts of Hercules inspire not restlessness, but a profound appreciation for rest itself. Feel the weight of the day lift from your own shoulders, just as the burden of the sky was lifted from Atlas, and eventually the burden of mortal life from Hercules. Allow your muscles to relax, your mind to quiet, and your breath to deepen into a steady, soothing rhythm. All the heroic deeds are done, the battles fought, the journeys completed. It is time for peace. It is time for your own well-earned, gloriously boring deep sleep. Sweet dreams.